And then, so the amplitude tells you what they're calling the vertical stretch. All right, half cosine of 2x. So this time b is 2. So 2 pi over b becomes 2 pi over 2, or just pi. Okay, so I know the entire cosine function will happen from 0 to pi. And I know the cosine function has its maximum in the beginning. And because the amplitude is 1/2, I know that this is my initial value. So then after the period, I know it ends up back at this point. I know halfway between the maximums is where the minimum occurs. And then halfway between the maximum and the minimum is where the 0 occurs. So here's one cycle of the cosine, and then just repeat that pattern. Okay, so this time our coefficient, our amplitude is negative. So we'll deal with that in a second. First, let's find the period. So the b value is 1/6. So 2 pi divided by 1/6 is 12 pi. So our usual sine function looks like this. But the fact that we have a negative a value means it will get reflected over the x-axis. So it'll look like this instead. So the zeros are at the same places, but the minimum happens first and the maximum happens later. Okay, so again, my zeros happen at the same place. So 0 at the end of the period and halfway through the period. Then for this reflected sign, the minimum occurs 1/4 of the way through, and the amplitude is -3, so -3. And then the maximum will now occur halfway between 6 pi and 12 pi, which is 9 pi. And then just repeat this pattern. -2 cosine of 1/3 x. So first the period. So period 6 pi. So from here to here will be 1 period. And then normally cosine looks like this. But because the a value is negative, it'll get reflected upside down, so it'll look like this instead. Okay, so that means the cosine will start at its minimum value, and the amplitude is 2. Okay, so then at the end of the period, it'll also return to its minimum value. Halfway between the minimums is where the maximum occurs. So between 0 and 6 pi is 3 pi. And then halfway between the minimum and the maximum is where the zeros occur. So halfway between 0 and 3 pi would be 3 pi over 2. And then halfway between 3 pi and 6 pi would be 4.5 pi, or 9 pi over 2. Okay, and then repeat this pattern. Okay, so b is 2, so the period is 2 pi over 2, or pi. So the entire sine period takes place from here to here. The amplitude is 1/3. So we know that the sine function has zeros at the beginning, the end of the period, and halfway. And the maximum occurs 1/4 of the way through. So in this case, the maximum is 1/3. And the minimum occurs 3/4 of the way through. So right here. And then just repeat this pattern. Okay, negative 1/4 cosine of 3x. So if b is 3, then the period is 2 pi over 3. Okay, so the entire cycle takes place from here to here. Cosine normally looks like this, but because a is negative, it gets reflected, so it looks like this instead. Okay, so that means that it'll start at the minimum value, and because of the amplitude, the minimum's at negative 1/4. And then it'll end after the end of the period back at negative 1/4. Halfway between the minimums is the maximum. And then halfway between the min and the max is the 0. Okay, so this would be pi over 6, and this would be pi over 2. And then repeat this pattern. Write an equation for the graph. So this one I'm going to call sine, because I see that it has a initial value of 0. Okay, so what's the period of this? It takes 1 unit to equal 1 full period. Okay, so period is 2 pi over b, and that equals 1. So solving for b, just multiply both sides by b, and we get 2 pi equals b. Okay, so the b value is actually 2 pi, and then we multiply it by the variable, which they're calling x. Okay, there is no midline shift, there's no vertical translation, but the amplitude, instead of the max being at 1, the max is at 3. Okay, over here, this one I'm going to call cosine because the initial value is not 0, but cosine typically looks like this. So since the initial value is at a minimum, not a maximum, I know that this must be reflected over the x-axis. Okay, so negative, let's just do a now. The amplitude is 1/2. Okay, so then what's the period? It takes 2 pi over 3 units to make 1 full cycle. So period is 2 pi over b, and that equals 2 pi over 3. So just comparing them, we can see that b must be 3. Okay, this one I'm going to call cosine because, no, I'm going to call it sine because the initial value is 0. And then sine normally looks like this. So since this one goes down instead of up, I know that this got reflected over the x-axis. So I have a negative in front. The amplitude is 3 units below, so negative 3. And the period, it takes pi units to make 1 full cycle. So 2 pi over b equals pi. multiply both sides by b, 2 pi equals b times pi, divide both sides by pi, and b equals 2. Okay, this one we're going to call cosine because it starts at the maximum, just like the typical cosine function does. The amplitude is 2. And what's the period? It takes 2 units. Sorry, the period formula is 2 pi over b, and apparently the period is 2. So solving for b, we can see that the b has to cancel out the pi, so b equals pi. All right, this one we're going to call sine because the initial value is 0. The period is 4 pi. Okay, so solving for b, b equals 1/2. And the amplitude is 1/2. Okay, this one, so it starts, the initial value is not 0, so we're going to use cosine. And then cosine typically looks like this. So since it starts at a minimum, not a maximum, we're going to know that it's a negative a value. And then a is, so then negative 1/3. Okay, so what's the period? The period is from here to here, one full period is 2 pi units. So then b is simply 1. So cosine of 1x, or just x. Okay, so sine function starts at 0. The period is 0.003. So after 0.003, it's back to where it started. And I know halfway between the beginning and the end of the period, sine has another 0. The amplitude is 2, so the maximum 1/4 of the way would be right here. And the minimum would be about here. Okay, and then just repeat that pattern.